Welcome tonight. We are here to hear about Black History Every Day, 3.9 Collective's Art of Research. That is what we're doing tonight. So thank you for being here. And this is part of our more than a month Black History celebration. So it started in January and will run through February. So we have a lot more great events coming up. So please stick around. That link that I put in the chat box has all kinds of details about it. We want to welcome you to the unceded land of the Ohlone tribal people and acknowledge the many Ramaytush tribal groups and families as the rightful stewards on the lands of which we reside here in our beautiful Bay Area. SFPL is committed to uplifting the names of these lands and community members from these nations. And we do this at the library by providing factual and useful information. That link contains reading and resource guides, and holding events similar to tonight's events all year round. You can let us know what territory you're coming from tonight in the chat box if you'd like. SFPL also wants to acknowledge that we are not a neutral institution and that we stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and support collective action to end structural, systemic, and institutional racism in our own house and in our own city and in our own community. We've been working a lot on a racial equity plan for the library, and that is definitely public access, and I can put that in the chat as well. Lots of stuff coming up, and big time. This is our largest campaign that San Francisco Public Library does, the One City, One Book campaign. This year, well, it's supposed to be annual, but we're all in a time warp. So this is our 16th One City, One Book. Chanel Miller, Know My Name, the story of her sexual assault on the Stanford campus and how she had to deal with the court systems and what life after sexual assault is like. So we also have amazing events lined up around this campaign. So heavy book. It's going to be some interesting programming. The programming is going to be intense. And also going to be, healing and lots of art. So come by. We're going to be celebrating with Isaac Julian and Judith Butler and Celeste Marie Berner, who are scholars of Frederick Douglass and, of course, the amazing Judith Butler. So please come check that out, the Guerrilla Girls. And this is all part of this One City, One Book campaign. January and February, we have a bi-monthly read every other, bi-monthly. On the Same Page, it's called, and we are celebrating Namwali Serpell's The Old Drift. Pick it up at your library to go or your favorite bookstore. We're highlighting Borderland Books and Marcus Books this month. And like I said, this is part of our more than a month celebration. And I'm going to just do the quickest breeze through of all these amazing programs that we have coming up, including tomorrow night's DeYoung talk about Soul of the Nation, the exhibition that was there now 2 years ago. It's about our soulmates, the National Park Service. They're the librarians of the natural world. We love them so much. And so they'll be doing an afternoon Faces of Resistance talking about National Park Service. Please try to come out for this one. It's an odd time and I really want to push it. So Black Joy and Resistance, Photography and Poetry, February 10th, 3 p.m. Quit work early, come to this. And, I'm not going to pass this one. Melissa Valentine in conversation with Amber Butts. Melissa is Oakland native, has written this book about grief and trauma and her brother's death. And it's painful again. So much painful stuff. Life is painful, but life is beautiful too, because she wrote this amazing book. And come. Moad, lots of stuff. But lastly, wear your mask too, because at Libraries to Go, my library family is out there working, getting books to people. Protect everyone that works out there and mask it up. All right, to the event. We have made it. Black History Every Day 3.9 Collective Art of Research, which I love this idea of being, we're the library. So the mission of 3.9 Collective is an association of African-American artists, curators, and art writers living in San Francisco, and came together to draw attention to the city's dwindling Black population. 3.9 Art Collective bears witness to this phenomenon and seeks to reverse it by drawing attention to historical and ongoing presence of Black artists in the city and creative expressions in its Black communities. Through multiple forms of presentation and outreach, they create and claim spaces to display their art, nurture young artists, and develop educational programs for students, and write about and curate exhibitions meant to generate productive cross-cultural dialogues. Tonight's members of 3.9 will talk about the role of research in their creative practices. We will hear how archives, libraries, museums, and dynamic contemporary communities are a resource and sources of deep knowledge. The panelists will talk about moving from engaged study and learning from others to interpretation and making. And tonight moderator is Jacqueline Francis. Jacqueline Francis is the author of Making Race, Modernism, and Racial Art in America, and co-editor of Romare Bearden, American Modernist. She's the co-executive editor of Panorama, Journal of the Association of Historians of American Art, a co-founder of the Association of Critical Race Art History, and at-large member of the National Committee for the History of Art. Her curatorial projects include A Matter of Time, new work by Adia Millet, Made in Hong Kong, Side by Side in the World, and Where is Here? She chairs the graduate program in the Visual Critical Studies at California College of Arts in San Francisco. She's the board president of the Queer Cultural Center, a San Francisco Bay Area community arts organization, a member of 3.9 and Collective Genus. Francis creates the occasional visual art object. She received an individual artist commission from the San Francisco Arts Commission in 2017. And we do have a lot of books by Jacqueline Francis in our collection that you can check out. So I will put that in a link, and I am now done talking and turning it over to 3.9 Art Collective.
Thank you, Anissa. And thanks for having us tonight at the San Francisco Public Library. Give me a second, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. Great. So we're greeting you, as Anissa said, from the traditional and unceded Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone lands. We honor these Native peoples. As Anissa said, tonight we're going to be talking about the practice of 3 of the 7 members of the 3.9 Art Collective. As Anissa noted, we are an association of African-American artists, curators, and writers who live in San Francisco. In 2009, we came together to draw attention to San Francisco's dwindling Black population. We bear witness to the presence of Black cultures in the city. We seek to reverse the exodus by drawing attention to the historical and contemporary presence of San Francisco Black artists and creative expression in our communities here in San Francisco. And as Anissa said, 3.9 Art Collective creates and claims spaces to display our artwork, nurture young artists, and develop educational programs for students, and to write about and curate exhibitions meant to generate productive cross-cultural dialogues. So tonight, 3 of the 7 members of the 3.9 Art Collective will present about their work. First will be Keija Lucas. Keija uses photography to explore ideas of home, heritage, and inheritance. She is interested in how ideas are passed down and seemingly inconsequential moments create changes that last generations. Her work has been exhibited at the Oakland Museum of California, Anglin Gilbert Gallery, the Headland Center for the Arts, San Francisco Arts Commission Galleries, California Institute of Integral Studies, the Palo Alto Arts Center, the Intersection for the Arts, the Mission Cultural Center, and Root Division, as well as in Venice Arts in Los Angeles. Lucas has been an artist in residence at Montalvo Center for the Arts, Grin City Collective, and the Wassaic Arts Residency. She is also a member of the curatorial council at Southern Exposure. Keija Lucas received her BFA from the San Francisco Art Institute, and her MFA from Mills College. Following Keija, we'll hear from Ron Moultrie Saunders, who is a co-founding member of the 3.9 Art Collective. Ron is a photographic artist and landscape architect. Originally from Jamaica, Queens in New York City, he currently lives in the Bayview neighborhood of San Francisco. He creates photographs that are made without the use of a camera. His artwork is in the San Francisco Arts Commission Civic Art Collection for projects he completed for the San Francisco Library, the Linda Brooks Burton Bayview branch, the Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital, Laguna Honda Hospital, and the Public Utilities Commission new headquarters in San Francisco. He was commissioned to create works for VMware in Palo Alto and Dallas, Texas, and for the San Francisco Travel Association, formerly the San Francisco Convention and Visitors Bureau. His art has been exhibited throughout the US, including The Secret Life of Plants, solo shows, San Francisco International Airport and Cordon Potts Gallery, and group shows such as Self-Skate at Middlesex County College in New Jersey in 2012, Exposed, Today's Photography, Yesterday's Technology at the San Jose Institute of Contemporary Art, and Measure of Time at the Oakland Museum of California at City Center. His work is published in several books, including Self-Exposure, the Male Nude Self-Portrait, and From Art to Landscape. Recently, Ron completed an artist in residence at STAR, the Shipyard Trust for the Arts in Hunters Point. His studio is located at Minnesota Street Project Studio in the Dogpatch area. Our last panelist will be William Rhodes. William was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and attended the Baltimore School for the Arts. He later received a BA in furniture building and design from the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, and an MFA from the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth. His creative works are in the collections of various galleries and museums. Most recently, his work was included in the permanent collection of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington. Along with his studio practice, William dedicates part of his time developing community-based art projects and hosting art classes and tours throughout Italy. He is a co-founder of the Black Art Collective, San Francisco's 3.9. So starting us off will be Keija. Keija, I'm gonna run your slides, so tell me when to go.
All right, cool. Why don't we go ahead and get started? I have to say, even with you reading, Jackie, which I feel like I could hear you read the phone book and be good with it, I feel like I need to edit my bio down. So my research for the I'm going to be specifically talking about the project Body of Work in Search of Home, although a lot of my work does involve research. But it started off about 10 years before I started working on the project, when I was in an undergraduate class at the San Francisco Art Institute, where my professor was an anthropologist, and she had this page come up in a reader that was about the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus, who came up, he had this book, several editions of it, called Systems of Nature, and he sent people around the world, and he himself recorded, made drawings of, and classified plants and animals around the world. In the 10th edition of his book, in Systems of Nature, he actually created a systemic hierarchy of man. And so here we have on the right an image of that book that I actually got a chance to see at the Exploratorium Skin exhibit, which was kind of interesting because I had seen pictures of it, but never the actual thing. As you can see in this English translation, all of the classifications of man were incredibly hierarchical and racist, as were many of the pseudoscientists at the time in the 1700s, when governments were looking to, and individuals were looking to find excuses for the incredibly racist practices of enslaving Africans and taking land and genocide that was happening. Oh, something's happening with the slides not showing. I'm pinned, I think. I'm pinned myself. Anyways, so that's my work started here and thinking about this. And for me, as a person from a mixed race family, I was born in the late 70s, and I grew up in what I call the melting pot generation, which was this incredibly, this time where I feel like people were trying to embrace diversity. However, what was happening is that we were asked to ignore our histories. And it was inadvertent, but it was a really real part of my life. And this was the first time that I figured out a way to talk about how race was an invention in order to continue a hierarchy between different races of people. Can you go to the next slide, please? So about 10 years after that time, or maybe fewer, I was with my friend Janelle. We were watching the Henry Louis Gates series, African American Lives, and looking at people who were actually learning about family history. And around that same time, my sister sent me this article in the farm column in the Grinnell Herald. I believe that's what it is. My mom's in the audience. She's probably going to correct me. You don't have to correct me, Mom. It's one of those Grinnell, Iowa papers. And this is a story about my dad's family history. So like learning about where I come from, which was a thing that I feel like I wasn't able to get growing up. And so here's a story of my great-great-grandparents. My great-great-grandfather bought himself and then his wife and children from slavery. They moved to Iowa, where 3 generations of my family lived. And this story is it's written by my great-grandfather about his dad. And so it gives a lot of information on my family. And my mom, who became a bit of a research assistant for me, even though she might not like that term, she actually transcribed all of this. And I went to the places that were in this article. Can you go to the next slide? So I also met several of my relatives. On the top left corner is my cousin Edith Renfro Smith, who that is on her 105th birthday. She was making herself a meal, and she will be 107 on July 4th. And here are several other photographs of my ancestors. I'm incredibly lucky that my family was able to hold on to photographs or have photographs and also pass down these stories. Can you go to the next slide? I know I only have like 20 seconds left. And then so what I did in 2013, this is my road trip around the US. I drove 5,000 miles by myself, scanning botanicals from places where various parts of my family lived since entering the United States. And again, coming from a mixed race family, all of my ancestors experienced the US in very drastically different ways. And what I wanted to do with this work was actually scan these botanicals that are from different parts of different parts of a hierarchy too. Roadside weeds, cultivated plants, things that we find beautiful, but also things that we might discard. Anyhow, that's my time. So I'm going to stop now. Thank you.
There's no rush for everybody. So audience members, what we're going to do is have each person kind of talk for 5 minutes to kind of give an overview about their process or their art. And Keisha just finished hers, will be followed by Ron, and then go with William. Then I'll say a little bit about Negro History Week, which was the origins of Black History Month. Then we'll go back to Keisha, Ron, and William. So take us away, Ron.
Okay. You want to go to my first slide? So good evening, everybody. I was commissioned by the San Francisco Art Commission to work on a artwork installation for the new library that was going to be built in the Bayview. And it's the Linda Brooks Burton Bayview Branch Library. And the inspiration for all of the work that I do and that I did for this particular project comes from place, history, and culture. So I always go into the community and start documenting images of what the environment looks like, what the community looks like, attend meetings if I can. So on the left, you'll see that there's San Francisco Chronicle. It's a poster, and there was a community meeting where people were talking about what is your community going to look like 10 years from now. So that's an example of finding out from the community the types of things that they are looking for and with a lot of hope and for the future. And then the image on the right, on my right anyway, is that shows the ship is in the bay, and it's very visible when you go along the shoreline in the Bayview. Next slide, please. And so what I did for this project is I went to what was then called the Amma Walden Bayview Branch Library and dug through their rare books of articles and memorabilia about the community. And as you can see, there's a study of Bayview Hunters Point that I went through. There were articles and photographs of people from the community from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Then there were plans that were done by the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency that was going to show how the future development was going to happen. And if you look really closely at the map that says Bayshore District, you can see Hunters Point, which was an area that became very popular for Blacks who were migrating from the South to the Bayview and to San Francisco. And the photograph of the woman with the hat is Miss Doris Vincent, who is a record keeper and very active in the community. And she provided me with tons of information about the community, the history of when she arrived there from Texas, and told me about communities that came there from Arkansas, and the ideas for medical clinics and housing. So there's a lot of research involved in just finding out who's in the community, what's the culture like, and just talking to people and finding out what's available. Next slide, please. So as you can see on Our Part of Town, a book, it's a file that I found at the Bayview Hunters Point section of the rare book collection at the San Francisco Main Library. So I go digging pretty deep to find historical information for projects that I work on, because I think it's really important for the community to feel that they're being heard when I work on projects. And the photograph is actually showing the image of the shipyard. And during the 40s and 50s and 60s, it was a very integrated community. So I do a lot of reconnaissance work, looking at the environment, photo documentation. I visit the site a few times to get a sense of the community and the site where the work is going to go. There's also a community orientation meeting that happens during the meeting with the San Francisco Art Commission, the panelists, and the community members. So that's another opportunity to gain information directly from the community about what they may be looking for. And then I follow up with some of the people who presented this information during the community meeting to get more information. And this all feeds into the way that I create my work and the type of imagery that I want to think I want to create as well. And that's it.
Okay, hello, everybody.
Thank
So
you,
happy.
Ron. Go ahead, William. I was just going to say, and now we'll have William Rhodes. Thanks, William. Go ahead.
So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. So my research really started from just, my fascination with San Francisco. So just really briefly, I'm originally from Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore, Maryland is what you would call, or at least it used to be labeled as a chocolate city. So a strong African-American population. So when I moved to San Francisco, it was a cultural change. When I got here in 2008, I did not see a lot of African Americans in San Francisco. But it was fascinating to me because I used to just hear stories. They were almost like rumors of, at one time there was this population that existed, and at one time there were these large communities. But I came at a point where I didn't actually see these things. So I started to really try to do some research to really understand what happened. And two of the communities that I focused on was the Bayview Hunters Point community and also the Fillmore. And the Fillmore, it led me to meet different people. And in this piece, with my research, I'm showing you two images, and not to confuse you. So one image is of a quilt that I produced, but the quilt, the reason why I wanted you to see that as far as my research, because these are some of the people that I actually met that started to tell me the history. So a lot of my research was based on actual events where I actually met people that were living, breathing people that experienced when San Francisco had a large, thriving Black population. And then that led me to more research, which led me to really start looking at a book called Harlem of the West. Some of you may know about that book. And if you don't, it's just a fascinating book, which was mind-blowing to me because it gave accounts of all of these nightclubs that existed in the Fillmore district and this bustling Black community. Shopkeepers, businesses, restaurants, and more than 24 jazz clubs. And I felt a strong connection with that because as I read, I began to hear about people that were reminiscent of where I grew up, because Billie Holiday is from Baltimore. Cab Calloway is from Baltimore. So the fact that they would make their way out to San Francisco, and some of you may know this, that San Francisco was part of the Chitlin Circuit, which was this circuit that African Americans would travel along. And San Francisco was one of the last stops. And some of these people that I grew up knowing these names, they made their way here. So this book, Harlem of the West, really solidified and gave me an understanding of just how vibrant the culture was. And we're talking 40s and 50s in particular. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, perfect. Yep. So two things that I also responded to and had to really, as an artist, try to write a really just really create something about that. When I was in the communities, certain communities, I started noticing people that were carrying a lot of things in suitcases. And I realized, with some of these people that I actually saw traveling around with these suitcases, many of them being African American, that they were homeless and that their lives were in these suitcases. So my research also began with this whole process of actually sitting down, meeting people that were from the community. Many of them were homeless, and hearing their stories and their connections to the community. And that within itself just gave me this amazing education and really just enlightened me with what this community used to look like at one point. Now, these are two pieces. I don't know if this part of the conversation we're talking about the work. Jackie, maybe help me with that, because I can go into that. Can you hear me, Jackie? So anyway, if you guys can still hear me. So these two pieces are in response to some of that research that I've actually done. One piece is called Man, M-A-N. The other piece is called Mother Gone. And these are both pieces that are direct responses to interviews that I had with living, breathing people in the community that told me their stories, and the work really responded to that. So I think that's my time. And I can go in more detail later.
Great, William. Thank you so much. Just catching up to Zoom. So let me just say a few words about Negro History Month, and I'm just going to jump back to this slide back here. So some of you might know that the figure that you see here at the top left was an editor of a publication called the Journal of Negro History. His name was Carter G. Woodson, and he was a historian. He first established what was then called Negro History Week in 1926 to foster greater knowledge and appreciation of African-American contributions and the building of African-Americans into what is American life and thought. So in order to support an annual event that was just a week long in 1926, Woodson started to circulate literature, bibliographies of literature, and other related materials among African-American institutions, colleges and universities, schools, public schools, private schools, newspapers, women's clubs, both in Washington, D.C., where he was based, as well as across the United States. So Woodson, who was the founder of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, announced that the second week of February would be Negro History Week. And we see a clipping here from a publication announcing to communities that there would be a Negro History Week observed. The dates of the second week of February were chosen because it was both weeks that honored the birthday of Frederick Douglass. He was born on February 14, as well as Abraham Lincoln. And both the birthdays of Lincoln and of Frederick Douglass had been celebrated in Black communities from the late 19th century. So from the very beginning, there was a primary emphasis placed on encouraging the teaching of Black Americans in the nation's schools. And in Washington, in the first week, there was a kind of lukewarm response to this whole idea of a Negro History Week. But eventually, it was taken up among Woodson's partners in terms of promoting Negro History Week were academics as well as intellectuals in places across the country, not just in Washington. And here I'm showing you a print that was co-sponsored by the International Workers Order, the IWW, to promote Negro History Week among the leftist communities, both Black and non-Black in the United States. I'm also showing you here that there were collaborators with Carter G. Woodson who were artists. You're looking at a photograph of Alma Thomas, who's a historical painter, who worked with Carter G. Woodson to promote Negro History Week at her school in Washington, D.C. She was a teacher for many years before she retired in the 1960s and became a full-time artist. Thomas was an amazing figure. She not only taught Black history in her classrooms, but she encouraged students to study art, both at Howard University's Art Gallery in Washington, D.C., as well as in the government museums in Washington, D.C., like the National Portrait Gallery and elsewhere. She took her students there so that they could see art in situ. And she also, of course, gave them opportunities to learn artistic skills. So really, when we think about Carter G. Woodson as the father of Black History Month in the United States, I think we can also get a broader picture of how many people were his collaborators, his co-workers in promulgating this idea, which in the 1970s became Black History Month. So let's go toward more from the artists. I think, should we go back to a slide, Keisha, or is there something else we could do?
This is fine where you're at right now.
Okay, great.
Talk about the work. The work that I made coming out of that research that I did, and research that is still ongoing, actually. I started this work in 2013, resulted in these images of scanned botanicals. I used this scanner as a camera for this work. I was looking at the early photographs of Anna Atkins, who was using cyanotypes to make her images, and she was using the Latin names for botanicals that Carl Linnaeus was using. Her book was actually the first photographic book ever made. And so I started off making pretty precise images with as little dirt as possible, but I would allow for maybe not the best specimen. You can see I'm using visual tropes of science here, like the images look a bit like a scientific, like you might see a specimen in a museum. They're printed quite large. These are about 30 by 40 inches, and they could actually be printed the size of floor to ceiling, and which I hope to get to do one day. And eventually I started I would go to a place and I would take multiple botanicals, I would scan them each separately, and then I would throw them all onto the scanner, and it creates this like really sort of motion in the image, like kind of this a little bit of chaos. I also left digital artifacting in the photograph. So if there's a bug in one of the botanicals that's like walking around or like wind blowing, you can see it by a little RGB line in the image. Go ahead and go to the next one. I started by only having like live botanicals, things that I think would be used in this sort of like the research of Linnaeus or Anna Atkins, but I started moving away from that. I would break my own rules. I started with a piece of dirt. I also took this piece of petrified wood from somewhere in Bristol, Virginia, called the resting tree. There's many graves from enslaved people, some of whom were more than likely my ancestors, who are buried under that tree. It said that an elderly enslaved man who was no longer able to work would watch the children and then started burying dead under there. And so this is a piece of petrified wood there. When I was in Bristol, I kind of got there and didn't know what I was doing, and was kind of like, I thought I was supposed to feel this, like, I'm going to this place, I'm walking on the dirt where my ancestors walked. I'm supposed to finally understand who I am, or like feel this connection to the land, or feel some semblance of something. And I really was just sort of questioning myself. And I think, I mean, I don't think I'm the only artist that does this when we get to a point where we're, you know, sort of making work and just sort of out there on our own. And I wasn't talking to anybody really. But I spent 3 days in Bristol, and I would go and sit under this tree every day. And just in the shade. It was really hot there. I'd never been to the South before. I went in the summertime. So it was really hot. And I really like felt like this piece of petrified wood from this very large oak tree was like super important as far as the history of that space. Could you go to the next slide? This is the piece of dirt that's from Bristol. After going to the Historical Association and asking them for permission to go onto this land and having them say to me, thank you for your interest in our rich history. And I didn't know at the time how to deal with that. I bit my tongue. I wanted to go there and I just said, okay, I'm gonna go. And I was lucky to be in Virginia and not in California, where people are very strict with OSHA laws and stuff, because when I was there, I saw, well, first of all, I have to admit, I forgot the card for my camera in my hotel room. So I got there and I was like, oh shit, what am I supposed to do? So then I said, you know, could I come back later when there's nobody here? But they let me take pictures while they were there, and they let me come back later. And so I'm wandering around this old house that they're refurbishing and like sweating and feeling like, what the fuck am I doing here? And I'm packing up the car eventually about after an hour, and the sun's shining through the clouds onto the piece of dirt. And I really thought about how my DNA is in this dirt, like the blood and sweat of my ancestors is in this dirt. And I just walked over to it, the sun shining through the clouds just onto this clump of dirt. And I just said, you know what, this is my fucking dirt. And I took it back to my hotel room where I was staying. And that's the first piece that I made for this body of work that I actually trusted that I knew what I was doing. Could you go to the next slide? I don't know if I think I have another image. This is a brick. This is one of the times where the dirt allowed me to feel like I can make pictures of other things besides botanicals, other artifacts. This is a brick from Buxton, Iowa. Buxton, Iowa is a place, I think that Cory Booker talked about his ancestors being from Buxton, but it was an integrated mining town in rural Iowa outside of Grinnell, about an hour. And so this is, right now it's this kind of dilapidated buildings in a big cornfield. There's a little bit of, I don't know if it's ditchweed or purposeful weed growing there, but I went there a couple times by myself. It's a little bit out there. I was a little scared. I feel like they might have guns in Iowa. And so I was very nervous, but taking pictures, and I collected this brick. I still can't find like what, because a lot of bricks are stamped with something that has to do with the area or who made it, but I still can't find what that is. Is there one more slide? I don't know. I'm sorry, I didn't write it down. Nope, that's it. All right, thank you.
So this is a project at the Linda Brooks Burton Bayview Branch Library, and I had to come up with ideas to talk about the place, the history, the culture. And so the images you're looking at here are actually in the interior of the library, and it's called Symbiotic Relationships 1 through 5. The top left is actually a homage to the Native Americans who were here before. So the technique that I'm using, as Jackie mentioned in my introduction, is all done in the darkroom without a camera, and I lay objects on top of photographic paper. And by doing that, the object actually blocks the light and you get a white silhouette. And it's very similar if you've ever done a sun print, where you actually take objects outside and you put them on this piece of paper and you get white shadows with a blue background. The brown created here is sepia toning. So again, the first image with the feather and the head profile is an homage to the Native Americans. And the feather that I'm using is actually a turkey feather. Turkeys are native to the US, and I thought it was important to use something that was native to the US. The image in the middle are feathers, and I wanted that to be a reference back to the natural environment, the wildlife that's in the area and still in the area. It's a great migration area for birds. And then again, talking about and thinking about the communities of people that came from the South. What did they do? What did they used to do? What did their ancestors do? So this is a figure, this is a silhouette with cotton balls. So again, making reference to the Black community that came from the South, and how do you represent that? So those are some of the struggles that I was tackling with. The image at the bottom that look like various things to people, seed pods, sea urchins. It again is talking about the plant life and the nature that surrounds the Bayview. The Bayview is an incredible area for nature. There are lots of native plants on the hillsides and along the water shore. Then the image with the hairs coming out of the side is actually collaged with sugar. So again, I'm thinking about African Americans who worked on sugar plantations. So I'm always looking for a way to incorporate the African history with the Black American history and with the community of the Bayou. Can you go back to the previous slide? And so this mural is actually in the courtyard. So these are permanent installations at the library. You're welcome to visit them when the library reopens. And I was looking for ways to talk about the essence of being human and also a connection to the waters that surround the Bayview Hunters Point area. And so the first figure on the left is collaged with salt. Salt's in the bay, it's in the water, it's in the oceans. It's in the oceans that the Mid-Atlantic, the Middle Passage that occurred. So again, I'm looking for these different layers of information to put into these figures, as well as there's salt in our bodies. The image in the middle, the double panel, I was looking for a way to talk about the work that we do or the work that people did at the shipyard. So these are like little shavings of metal that float down when you're carving, when you're shaving, when you're working with metal. And again, making reference back to the shipyard. And the last image is the figure with water bubbles. And those water bubbles, again, making reference back to the Bay, which was so important to the Bayview Hunters Point community. Also water that's in our bodies. So I'm looking for ways to talk about the history, the culture, and also the human experience and the human body. Next figure. And so this happened 2 years after the library opened. There was the San Francisco trolley dancers would jump on Muni and they would dance on platforms. Well, the choreographer found this work at the library and decided to expand their dance performance into the library. And I found this incredibly inspiring, and it really told me that people in the community respond to art when it's presented to them, and they respond in different ways. And I love the fact that they decided to incorporate their bodies with this artwork that's in the outdoor courtyard. That's it.
Great. William, should I go back now for you?
Yes, please.
Oh,
He's the other way.
That's perfect. So the
I keep skipping over something for you. Hang on a second.
that's all right. That's
looking.
perfect.
Okay.
There we go. So that's the quilt is just one example. So this, after doing all of the research, I really came up with this idea of calling it that my series of works, the Outmigration. And one of the things that I started to focus on was creating a series of quilts, which is still ongoing. I felt like quilting was number one, a way to really connect with the community. And also, I come from a tradition of having family that were quilters. And, it's a strong African American tradition. So I wanted to continue that. But I wanted to really connect that community, this community. I was the foreigner. I was kind of the guy, the new alien to the community. And what was my role in that? So by meeting people, interviewing a lot of these elders, I started to incorporate their portraits in these quilts. And for me, it started off in the beginning. It wasn't the most easiest process because, again, I was the outsider. And I'm asking people, some people that are living on the streets, hey, could I, do a portrait of you and add it to a quilt? And you can only imagine the responses that I got. But over time, I started to kind of gain more trust. And I started to include more people in these quilts. And now I've been doing this process for the past 6 years. So this is just one of the quilts. This is called the Sankofa quilt. And again, there are people from the community. Some of you may recognize some of the people in these portraits. But for me, I really knew that this was an important project because I would walk around the neighborhood and then I would have people stop me and say, hey, what's going on with that quilt? Did you finish my portrait? They started to actually ask me about it. So then when I produced the quilt, then it became this whole community pride, which to me was just so amazing. And I just felt so honored to have so many people in the community start to really invest in this project and feel like they are a part of this community quilt, these community quilts. Can we go to the next one? Yep, perfect. So the two pieces that you see in front of you, they're still part of the Outmigration series. The Gone Mother, the one piece, which is a shoe, it was based off of this interview. There was a lady that used to be right off of 3rd Street. I would see her there. She had a suitcase and she had a little dog. And, this lady had an amazing story. She was homeless, but she had this entire life where she had a history. Her family owned property, had businesses in the Bayview community. And she was on this corner every day. And, this person who people just walked by every single day was had so much history and was a fixture in that community. So I wanted to do a piece dedicated to her. And so in the area where she pretty much stayed, there was always objects around, shoes, pieces of clothing, bags. They were just always in this area. And I was able to get a shoe which was left. It wasn't her shoe. I didn't take her shoe. Just want you to know. But there was this object that was a throwaway object, which was a shoe. And I felt like it really gave kind of the energy of that area. And with that shoe, I was able to put a portrait on fabric. I sewed it inside of the insole of the shoe, which you can see. And I included neon. For me, neon was really important because of, it's one of the early lighting sources. And to me, neon also has a mystical quality to it. And as many of you may know the process, but you actually, just really quickly, you actually blow glass tubes and then you put gases in the tubes. Based on the electricity that hits that gas, you get a certain color. So the whole science of that is amazing. And for me, taking this throwaway object, putting these portraits inside of it and including the neon, gives it a whole different element, because even if you walk past this artwork, this neon will draw you in. And that was the whole purpose. My whole really statement is that these are people that we walk by every day and we may not see any value in them, but they have so much value to the community and they're holding the community together. The next piece is called Man. And this piece was Man because one of the homeless persons that I interviewed, he told me his name was Man. And I said, okay, well, what is your birth name? He said, I just told you, it's Man. And he described to me that his family gave him the name Man because they were tired of him being referred to as a boy. And they said, if you're called Man, no one can ever refer to you as a boy. And he was a person who was in the war. He was a war hero. He had a whole entire history. This is a person who was a veteran and dedicated his life to serving our country. And he ended up, for various circumstances, a homeless person. So that was just so fascinating to me. So I included a portrait. Now, that's not a portrait of Man. He would not let me take a picture of him, but I found someone that reminded me of that in a stack of old photographs that my family had. So this is a person from World War II. He's an African-American veteran. And the background of it, you could see kind of behind that fabric, there is some writing on a piece of cloth. That is an actual duffel bag from World War I. I'm sorry, from World War II. An African-American soldier in my family, that was their duffel bag. So I wanted to include that to create this energy in this piece. So I built the suitcase and wanted it to have a very old vintage look, as if it was some type of a war chest. And I took an American flag and of course incorporated that in the piece. And with this neon Man, again, you can't underestimate Man, because you could walk past it a million times. When you plug in this piece, the first thing you're going to see is that neon Man. So I wanted that to really kind of give reference to this person that I interviewed and just show how much respect and honor that I had for him. I think that's it. Yep, I just have those slides. Thank you.
Thanks, William. We're gonna take some questions and some comments in the chat. We invite people to type in, and I'm gonna stop sharing the PowerPoint in a second. But before I do that, I just wanna show you this last bit of information here, that the 3.9 Art Collective has the members Rodney Ewing, me, Jacqueline Francis, Keisha Lucas, who you heard from tonight, Saran Norris among the founding members, along with Rodney and William, Ramakan O. Arwisters, William Rhodes, and Ron Moultrie Saunders. You can find us at on email via emailing us, on Facebook, via Instagram, as well as on the internet at 3.9artcollective.com/. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen right now, and then we can go to looking at each other. So let's see if there's any questions in the chat.
There are two in the Q&A function.
Great. I saw that at one point, and for some reason, I'm not seeing it now. Oh, there it is.
One of the questions is that one question that we always get. Yes, this will be recorded and available on YouTube, and I will put that link in the chat again and again and again.
Great. Thank you, Joan Kung, for that question. Question from Teresa Moore for William. Is that the Sankofa bird in the middle of the quilt?
Thank you, Teresa. Yes, it absolutely is a Sankofa bird. And as we know about the Sankofa bird, I mean, that is a strong image symbol in African folklore. You know, the Sankofa bird is really the symbol that brings us back to our connection, our origin of things. And it's always this discussion of us, many of African people that have been experiencing, you know, all of the trauma and things over the years. The hope and the wish is to bring us back to the source. So thank you for recognizing that.
Yeah, I think that's a great symbol for everything that the three of you presented tonight. That Asante symbol from Ghana, Sankofa, it's one of these proverb images that means go back and get it, go back and retrieve it. And I've heard in your presentation, William, in terms of interviewing people, learning about people's histories, that you are retrieving histories of people in San Francisco, people of African descent. Keisha's talked about retrieving histories in terms of family histories by traveling across the country. And of course, Ron, retrieving histories that are both personal as well as environmental in terms of your research in San Francisco. I think there's a resonance about retrieving through each of your presentations tonight. I wanted to ask you in terms of what you're doing, especially in this time, the month of Black History Month, 28 days, 29 days in a leap year, especially in this time of Black Lives Matter, especially in this time of insurrection at the Capitol, especially in this time of victories, in instance in Georgia with two progressive Democratic senators. You know, this is a really peak in time. And I just look back and think back to when Carter G. Woodson started Negro History Week in the late 1920s. It was also a really peak in time. It was the Great Depression starting in 1929. It was the era of Gone with the Wind, first the book and then the movie, and all of this romanticization about the lost cause of the Confederacy and how great things were for Black people under slavery and that it wasn't so bad. And I wonder if each of you could think about your projects as you've shown them tonight as responding to the sort of piquancy and the tenor of our moment in 2021.
Well, I can tell you this. So I feel in some ways, in particular with my quilts, I feel like that is the response with that is again, going back to the source and people for wise counsel. So not only with my project do I actually just do these portraits, I'm having conversations with seniors. And just to let you know, I have seniors that range, and I don't want to insult anyone because I'm getting close to this age myself, but I'll tell you the starting age is 64. And I have people on the quilt that are 104, 103, no, 104. Yep. So it's a long range. So for me, as far as the response, going back to the source and really sitting and asking these people questions, because they lived through all of these changes that took place, whether it be the civil rights movement, some even Jim Crow era, and really asking them questions. And they actually are, you know, some people before the pandemic, I'm watching TV with people as these things are unfolding and they're talking to me live, telling me, you know, hey, baby, this is what's going to happen. You know, sweetheart, no, you know, I saw this before. I know what's going to happen. So I'm even unconsciously recording these things into those quilts, you know, that history. So for me, that's kind of my way of, I don't know if that's so much a response, but really dealing with this and gathering that information.
Keisha?
It's so funny because right now, like my mind's drawing a blank because I'm like, what am I doing right now? But I think in respects to this work, like William said, I really appreciate talking to elders and just like listening to what they have to say. I feel really lucky to have access to family stories and understanding part of my family history going back to the early 1800s, which I feel like a lot of people with African American descent don't necessarily have access to that, like back into the 1800s, back into the 1700s, and like really understanding sort of places where my family were. And also, somebody's told me once, like, well, your work's not so political. And I was like, well, maybe if you look at it as botanicals, it's not so political, but it's kind of sneak attack political. And that when you get into it and you're like, oh, here's this thing, and then I'm going to have a conversation with you about how race is an invention, and yes, it exists because of that, but how it's still affecting us today. And when I talk about heritage and inheritance in my bio or in my artist statement, I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about ideas that we inherited over generations. I'm talking about the experience of my 7th generation grandmother and how that affects my life today, and how experiences of our ancestors in this world and in this country affect our lives today, not only like sociopolitically, but also individuals' decisions and individuals' situations that they were put in outside of their control as well. So I feel like by looking into this history, I'm saying it's almost like being a flashlight or a highlighter and being like, no, here's this thing and we're going to talk about it now, but I invited you in with something that's beautiful, that feels approachable to you, and now we're going to have this conversation that maybe you didn't expect to have when you were looking at a picture of a plant. And so I feel like that's my way of approaching this. And I feel like, although it's like not necessarily a story that we like, that everybody thinks of, I just feel like it's a very, like going into my own family history is the way that I can approach these things. And also that I feel like that other folks, inviting other people to like look into that too, because not everybody has thought about it or has like decided to be interested in that yet in their life. So yeah.
Thanks, Keisha. Ron?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I recently got a chance to work on a art proposal for another project in the Bayview, and I had an opportunity to actually talk to young people who grew up here. And the Bayview is changing. It's an incredibly rich cultural environment filled with amazing history that is being lost. And the young people I was talking to realized that they don't want to lose a sense of what the Black community was like here. And they're also learning about their community, through these historical moments. And, back in the 60s, there was a major riot here that only gets talked about when it's an anniversary time. And it was talked about back in 2016, when the federal marshals and all of these police forces came in and shut down the Bayview. People have to be reminded of that history. And so these young people are like, we don't want to be forgotten. And it's becoming so diverse that there are other communities that I'm learning about, like the Polynesian community is actually increasing in numbers. They want to be heard. They want to be seen. And the other side, you have people like Ms. Doris Vincent, who's in her late 80s, who has amazing amount of history that she can tell you, as well as has collected. And there's Oscar James, who's in his late 70s, who has information about what happened here in the past. So balancing and both of those communities at the same time. And like William's in a great place because he's doing intergenerational work. So these young people can actually benefit from hearing what happened when you guys were here in the 50s and 60s, and see that there's a relationship between the past and the present. Black Lives Matter really brought that out. And people want to have a sense of pride of their community, and they also want to have a sense of pride for their history, and they don't want other people to forget it. And during this, I probably put the commission in jeopardy for myself, but I said, you've got to stop giving Bayview temporary art installations. They fade, you don't come back in to repaint them. They need to be permanent materials so that they stay here and so that people feel a sense of pride for their communities.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Keisha.
Mhm.
Thanks, William. I'm going to check the Q&A. From Vivian, was Todd shipyards in Richmond similar during World War II as South SF shipyards? Was the neighborhood dynamics changing as the shipyards were no longer active? Note, I have enjoyed open studios at the shipyards as well as Recology Center shows. I don't know if I can respond to that question about Todd shipyards in Richmond during World War II, as well as the South San Francisco shipyards. Maybe one of the audience members can, and we'll check back to see if.
It's really interesting. There actually is a connection between the communities in Richmond and the communities in Bayview. And you'll hear about families that came here from the South looking for jobs. And if there weren't jobs available at the San Francisco shipyard, they would go to the Richmond shipyard. So there is a connection between both of those communities.
Thanks, Ron.
Mm-hmm.
Anonymous attendee asks, how did William get the portraits on the fabric?
I use, and I'm telling you guys a secret. I shouldn't tell you this, but I do the old-fashioned technique, which is pretty much like a transfer machine, which is a good old-fashioned projector. I take the photographs, lay the image on the projector, and shine it on a piece of fabric, piece of cotton fabric. Then I go back in and I do the painting and the drawing, more line work and everything else. Each one is done by hand, but yeah, I'd like to say I'm an old master, but you know what? I use the old techniques, the projector.
Thanks, William. We have a couple of minutes. Joan Kung has another question. Is the SF Arts Commission supporting community artists like you? I think we need to expand the art to all San Francisco.
They are trying to be supportive. They have set up a Bayview Artist Registry so that projects that happen in this community are actually connected to artists who are connected to the Bayview. So that's one of the things that they are doing. They've increased their outreach to artists who have some connection to the Bayview.
Yeah, and I can say, as Anissa said during the introduction, I've received an individual artist commission to work on a collection of short stories about 4 years ago. So in that way, the commission has supported my creative practice. Keisha?
Yeah, I also have received an individual artist commission as well. I think William too, and maybe Ron.
I've received 2.
We have another question. We're coming up on ending the broadcast tonight. It's 8:14. Question for Jacqueline Francis from Emily. Hi, Emily. Could you also share how you see the work shared tonight in light of the present moment? The obvious thing is to show the variety of practices amongst the 3 artists here tonight, which I think is really interesting. Obviously, photography is important to a lot of the work that they do. In terms of beginnings and maybe even to some extent the finished project. But I do think what works too is the idea of a sense of representation here. We see figural abstraction in quite a few of the projects we saw tonight, but we see a strong sense of the figure, whether it's the flora of the world or human figures here. I thought that was quite interesting that each of the artists showed work in which the figure is part of what they're presenting. Some of Ron's work is non-objective, but it starts with figure and we don't lose the sense of figure. It's not totally non-objective. I thought that was really interesting, especially when we often think that we have a sense of what Black looks like and what Black is, much less what artists who are Black present. So I think I should turn it back over to Anissa for the final words.
Here I come. All right. Keija, Jacqueline, Ron, William, thank you so much. That was so great and informative, and all of your work is beautiful. Jacqueline, we can read your work. Thank you for being the moderator again, controlling the situation. And we do have members of 3.9 coming up. February 16th, we'll have Cheryl and Ramakan talking about the history of Black craft and folk art influences. And then the library spotlights, you know, we're on this calendar of cultural awareness calendar, we call it. So Black History Month, we stretch it out for 2 months, but we try to get artists to kind of go with our graphics and share their spotlight and try to shine on them as much as we can, you know, give them that tiny honorarium. But we love doing that. And so Ron, we've used many times. We love Ron. So his artwork is all over our library. But this time around, we have Rodney Ewing has agreed to share his artwork. So you can find all of his art on our webpage right now and a little bit about him. But we're going to have an artist spotlight with Rodney on February 25th. So I hope you all come out for that. And that link again that I shared with you has all of this information, as well as one more time shared. Yes, you can see this on YouTube tomorrow or tonight, even after this, like you can just watch it again. So thank you, 3.9 Collective. We are in great appreciation of you and sharing your art. And we look forward to what you do next. All right. Good night,
Thank you.
everybody.
Good night, everybody.
I know
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's lots of love and claps out there. It's all in the chat river.